March 15, 1985. Famous artist Marcus Aldridge was putting the finishing touches on a painting he'd been working on for months when he simply disappeared. His studio remained untouched for decades, his final masterpiece hanging on the wall like a silent witness. But in 2024, when art experts decided to restore that painting, they made a discovery behind the canvas that no one saw coming, a discovery that revealed the artist hadn't disappeared at all, but had been trying to tell us something all along. Marcus Aldridge had always been different from other artists. While his contemporaries painted abstract expressions or modern interpretations, Marcus specialized in hyper-realistic portraits that seemed to breathe with life. His subjects would stare out from their canvases with eyes so vivid, so penetrating, that gallery visitors often felt as though they were being watched. Critics called his work haunting. Collectors called it genius. Marcus himself called it necessary. The painting he was working on that fateful March day was unlike anything he had ever created before. It was a portrait of a young woman with flowing auburn hair and emerald eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She wore a simple white dress that appeared to glow against the dark background, and her expression carried a mixture of sadness and hope that was almost impossible to capture and paint. Yet Marcus had done exactly that, spending countless hours perfecting every detail, every shadow, every reflection in her eyes. His studio, located in the historic arts district of downtown Portland, was a place of controlled chaos. Canvases in various stages of completion lined the walls, paint tubes were scattered across multiple palettes, and the air was thick with the smell of turpentine and linseed oil. Marcus was known for his meticulous work habits. He would arrive at his studio every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, work until noon, take a brief lunch break, then paint until well past sunset. His dedication was legendary among the local art community. On the morning of March 15, 1985, Marcus arrived at his studio as usual. His assistant, a young woman named Elena Rodriguez, saw him enter the building at his customary time. She was working in the shared supply room down the hall and heard him moving around his space, preparing his materials for the day's work. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Elena later told police that she heard Marcus working throughout the morning. The soft scraping of his palette knife mixing colors, the gentle tapping of his brush against the canvas, the occasional creak of his easel as he adjusted its position, all the familiar sounds of an artist at work. She had planned to check on him around lunchtime to see if he needed anything from the supply store, but when she knocked on his studio door at 12:30, there was no answer. Initially, Elena wasn't concerned. Marcus sometimes became so absorbed in his work that he would forget to eat or even acknowledge visitors. She left a note on his door and went to lunch, assuming he would see it when he emerged from his creative trance. But when she returned at 2 o'clock and found the note still untouched on his door, she began to worry. Elena used her master key to enter the studio. What she found defied explanation. The room was exactly as Marcus always left it during a work session. His palette was freshly prepared with mixed colors that were still wet, his brushes were clean and arranged in perfect order, his coffee cup sat half full on the windowsill, still warm to the touch. The painting he had been working on stood on his easel, apparently completed. But Marcus himself was nowhere to be found. The police investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately fruitless. Detective Ray Morrison, who headed the case, interviewed everyone who had access to the building. The security footage showed Marcus entering at 8 o'clock, just as Elena had stated, but it never showed him leaving. The building had only 2 exits, both monitored by cameras, and neither had recorded Marcus departing at any point during the day. Detective Morrison found no signs of struggle in the studio. Nothing was missing, nothing was damaged, nothing was out of place. Marcus's wallet was still in his jacket pocket, hanging on the coat rack. His car keys were on his desk. His car was still parked in its usual spot behind the building. It was as if the artist had simply vanished into thin air while in the middle of painting. The investigation expanded to include Marcus's personal life. Detectives discovered that he had been living a relatively solitary existence. He had no wife, no children, no close family members. His parents had died in a car accident 10 years earlier, and he had no siblings. His social circle consisted primarily of other artists, gallery owners, and collectors who knew him through his work but couldn't claim to know him personally. Financial investigators found that Marcus's affairs were in perfect order. His bank accounts showed regular deposits from art sales, his bills were paid on time, and he had no outstanding debts. There was no evidence of financial distress or any reason he might have wanted to disappear voluntarily. In fact, his career was at its peak, his paintings were selling for record prices, and he had several major exhibitions scheduled for the coming year. As weeks turned into months, the investigation gradually wound down. Detective Morrison remained convinced that Marcus had to have left the building somehow, despite what the security cameras showed. He theorized that perhaps the artist had found a way to exit through a window or had hidden somewhere in the building until after hours. But extensive searches of the building and surrounding area turned up no trace of the missing artist. The art world mourned the loss of one of its most promising talents. Marcus's existing works immediately became even more valuable, as often happens when an artist dies or disappears. The painting he had been working on, the portrait of the auburn-haired woman, was considered his masterpiece. It was acquired by a private collector, Harold Whitmore, for an undisclosed sum that art world insiders estimated to be well over $1 million. For 39 years, the painting hung in Harold Whitmore's private gallery in his Beverly Hills mansion. Thousands of visitors admired it during charity events and private viewings. Art historians wrote extensively about it, analyzing Marcus's technique and the emotional depth he had achieved in the subject's expression. The portrait became known as The Last Lady and was considered one of the finest examples of contemporary realism ever created. Harold Whitmore treasured the painting above all others in his collection. He often told visitors that he could spend hours staring into the subject's eyes, feeling as though she was trying to communicate something important to him. He had positioned the painting in a place of honor in his gallery, with special lighting that seemed to make the woman's skin glow and her eyes sparkle with life. In early 2024, Harold Whitmore passed away at the age of 87. His extensive art collection was bequeathed to various museums and institutions according to his will. The Last Lady was donated to the Portland Museum of Fine Arts, both as a tribute to Marcus Aldridge's legacy and as a homecoming of sorts for the artist's final work. The museum was thrilled to receive such a prestigious piece. Dr. Sarachin, the museum's chief curator, had been familiar with Marcus's work for years and had always hoped to acquire one of his paintings for their permanent collection. The Last Lady would become the centerpiece of their contemporary art wing. However, before the painting could be displayed publicly, it needed to undergo a thorough conservation assessment. Nearly 4 decades of hanging in a private home, even under carefully controlled conditions, could cause subtle damage that might need to be addressed. The museum's head conservator, Robert Martinez, was assigned to examine the piece and recommend any necessary restoration work. Robert had been working as a conservator for over 20 years and had examined thousands of paintings. He was known for his meticulous attention to detail and his ability to detect problems that others might miss. When he first laid eyes on The Last Lady in his conservation studio, he was struck by how well preserved it appeared. The colors were still vibrant, the paint surface showed no signs of cracking or flaking, and the varnish remained clear and unblemished. But as Robert began his detailed examination under specialized lighting, he noticed something unusual. Along the edges of the canvas, where it was attached to the stretcher frame, there appeared to be slight irregularities in the thickness. It was barely perceptible, but as trained eye caught the subtle variations that suggested there might be something between the canvas and its backing. This discovery puzzled Robert. In his experience, such irregularities usually indicated that foreign materials had been inserted behind the canvas during the painting's creation. Sometimes artists would pad certain areas to create texture effects, or they might slip studies or sketches behind their canvases for reference. But the irregularities in The Last Lady were more extensive than would be typical for such practices. Intrigued, Robert decided to perform a more detailed investigation. He used advanced imaging techniques, including X-ray photography and infrared reflectography, to see if he could determine what was causing the irregularities. The results were immediately striking. The X-rays revealed that there were definitely foreign objects between the canvas and its backing, objects that appeared to be papers or documents of some kind. Robert faced a difficult decision. Removing the canvas from its original stretcher to examine what was behind it would be a risky procedure that could potentially damage the painting. However, the presence of unknown materials behind the canvas could pose long-term preservation risks. After consulting with Dr. Chen and other museum officials, they decided to proceed with the investigation. The process of separating the canvas from its backing was painstakingly slow and delicate. Robert worked with surgical precision, using specialized tools to carefully loosen the canvas from the stretcher frame without causing any damage to the painted surface. As he worked, he could see that there were indeed multiple layers of paper adhered to the back of the canvas. What Robert discovered when he finally removed the backing would change everything anyone thought they knew about Marcus Aldridge's disappearance. Carefully preserved between layers of archival-quality tissue paper were dozens of pages covered in Marcus's distinctive handwriting. The papers appeared to be diary entries, letters, and detailed notes, all dated from the weeks and months leading up to his disappearance. The first document Robert examined was dated February 1, 1985, just 6 weeks before Marcus vanished. It read, "I've discovered something terrible about the Whitmore Gallery exhibition. What I thought was going to be the pinnacle of my career has turned into a nightmare. Harold isn't who he pretends to be, and neither are his associates. I've stumbled into something that goes far deeper than art collection." Dr. Chen was called immediately to the conservation studio. As she read through the documents with Robert, the true story of Marcus Aldridge's disappearance began to emerge. According to his own written account, Marcus had been approached by Harold Whitmore in late 1984 about participating in what was described as an exclusive exhibition for wealthy private collectors. Marcus wrote extensively about his initial excitement regarding this opportunity. Harold had promised him exposure to the most affluent art collectors in the country, people who would pay premium prices for original works. The exhibition was to be held in a private gallery space, and Marcus would be one of only 5 artists featured. It seemed like the break he had been working toward his entire career. But as Marcus began working with Harold and his associates to prepare for the exhibition, he started noticing disturbing patterns. Other artists who had participated in similar exhibitions seemed to have disappeared from the art world entirely. When Marcus tried to contact them, he found that their phone numbers were disconnected, their studios had been abandoned, and no one in the art community had heard from them in months or even years. One entry, dated March 10, just 5 days before his disappearance, revealed Marcus's growing fear. "I've been asking too many questions, and Harold is becoming suspicious. Yesterday I overheard a phone conversation he was having with someone about removing problems permanently. I think they know that I know what they're doing to the other artists. I need to find a way to expose this, but I'm running out of time." The documents revealed that Harold Whitmore was operating what amounted to an elaborate fraud scheme targeting talented but financially struggling artists. He would approach them with promises of lucrative exhibitions and wealthy buyers, then gradually isolate them from their support networks while gaining control over their work and their lives. The artists would be convinced to sign contracts that gave Harold extensive rights to their creations, often under the guise of exclusive representation agreements. Marcus had discovered that several artists who had worked with Harold had been forced to create forgeries of famous works, using their legitimate artistic skills to produce high-quality fakes that Harold could sell to unsuspecting collectors for enormous profits. When artists refused to cooperate or threatened to expose the operation, they would simply disappear, leaving behind only their paintings, which Harold would continue to sell while claiming the artists had died or moved away. The most chilling document was Marcus's final entry, dated March 15, 1985, the day he disappeared. "They're coming for me today. I can feel it. Harold called this morning and insisted that I meet him at my studio to discuss the final preparations for next week's exhibition. But I know it's a trap. I've hidden all the evidence I've gathered behind this painting. If something happens to me, I pray that someday someone will find these documents and expose what Harold and his people have been doing." Marcus's final entry continued, "I've spent the last few weeks working on this portrait, knowing it might be my last. The woman in the painting isn't real, she's a composite of all the victims I couldn't save. Her eyes hold all the sadness and hope that Harold has stolen from so many artists. If anyone ever finds these papers, Please don't let our work and our lives be forgotten. The implications of Marcus's hidden documents were staggering. Dr. Chen immediately contacted the Portland Police Department, and Detective Morrison's old case files were reopened with new urgency. Though Detective Morrison had retired years earlier, the current investigators were able to piece together what had likely happened on that March day in 1985. According to Marcus's account, Harold and his associates had indeed come to the studio that day, probably expecting to either coerce Marcus into cooperation or eliminate him as a threat to their operation. But Marcus had anticipated their arrival and had prepared accordingly. The final document behind the painting was a detailed map of Portland's underground tunnel system, with specific routes marked and annotated in Marcus's handwriting. Portland's downtown area was built over an extensive network of underground tunnels that had been constructed in the late 1800s for various purposes including utilities, storage, and unfortunately, some more nefarious activities. Many of these tunnels had been forgotten over time, but Marcus had apparently researched them extensively and had found a way to use them for his escape. The documents revealed that Marcus had planned his disappearance carefully. He knew that simply trying to expose Harold through normal channels would be dangerous and potentially ineffective, given Harold's wealth and connections. Instead, Marcus had decided to disappear in a way that would make it appear as though Harold had succeeded in eliminating him, while actually allowing Marcus to escape and start a new life elsewhere. The security cameras hadn't shown Marcus leaving because he hadn't used the building's normal exits. Instead, he had accessed the underground tunnel system through a forgotten maintenance entrance in the building's basement. The tunnels would have allowed him to travel several blocks away from his studio before emerging safely beyond the range of Harold's surveillance. But Marcus's brilliance lay not just in his escape plan, but in how he had preserved the evidence of Harold's crimes. By hiding the documents behind his final painting, he had ensured that the evidence would eventually surface, but only after enough time had passed for him to establish his new identity safely. He had even included instructions for how to contact him once the truth was revealed. Following Marcus's instructions, investigators were able to trace him to a small coastal town in Oregon, where he had been living under the name Michael Allen for the past 39 years. He had continued painting, but had sold his work only locally and had deliberately kept a low profile. When investigators finally contacted him, he was initially cautious but ultimately relieved that his plan had finally worked and the truth about Harold Whitmore could be exposed. Marcus, now 78 years old, agreed to return to Portland to testify about his experiences and help investigators build a case against Harold's operation. Though Harold himself had died, many of his associates were still alive and could potentially be prosecuted for their roles in the fraud scheme and the disappearances of other artists. The reunion between Marcus and Elena Rodriguez was particularly emotional. She had never stopped wondering what had happened to him and had kept his studio space exactly as he had left it, hoping against hope that he would someday return. When Marcus walked back into his old studio for the first time in nearly 4 decades, both he and Elena were overcome with emotion. Marcus explained that leaving Elena and his other friends behind had been the most difficult part of his plan. But he had known that any attempt to contact them would have put both them and himself in danger. He had spent years hoping that someday he would be able to return and explain what had happened, and the discovery of his hidden documents had finally made that possible. The investigation into Harold's art fraud operation revealed that it had been even more extensive than Marcus had realized. Over a period of more than 20 years, Harold and his associates had targeted dozens of artists, stealing millions of dollars worth of artwork and ruining countless careers. Some artists had been forced into hiding like Marcus, while others had simply disappeared entirely, their fates still unknown. The Portland Museum of Fine Arts decided to create a special exhibition telling the story of Marcus's disappearance and the exposure of Harold's crimes. The Last Lady became the centerpiece of this exhibition, displayed alongside the documents that had been hidden behind it and the story of how one artist's courage and ingenuity had ultimately brought justice to many victims. Marcus returned to painting full-time, creating new works that reflected both his original style and the experiences he had gained during his years in hiding. His comeback exhibition was one of the most attended art events in Portland's history, with people coming from around the world to see the work of the artist who had literally disappeared into his own painting. The story of Marcus Aldridge's disappearance and return became legendary in the art world. It demonstrated not only the vulnerability of artists to exploitation but also the power of art itself to preserve truth and ensure that justice eventually prevails. Marcus's final painting, The Last Lady, was no longer just a beautiful portrait but a testament to the courage of artists who refused to let their voices be silenced.